Okay, well, I'd like to welcome you to this, the third session, and I feel very fortunate today with our duo here. We brought Steve Evans out of retirement specifically for this deal. Steve taught history at Lewis Clark State College in Lewiston for years, and he wrote his dissertation on Joseph and McWhorter, and we mentioned this book, McWhorter. Remember that? Yellow Wolf and Here Be My Chiefs. And Steve then wrote, oh, this is a new. So this is this is a biography of McWhorter that Steve wrote, and it's terrific. And McWhorter is one of the most interesting, fascinating characters in the White West, right?
That's the original.
Okay. That's the one I have. Anyway, I was just telling Steve that long story short, I'm writing an essay on Nez Perce literature for Oregon Historical Quarterly. And the purpose of this essay is, why are so many people still interested in the Nez Perce, and how are they interested? And I actually ended the little essay with Voice of the Old World, because that's part of the reason. Anyway, so Steve Evans is the professional historian, but he and Alan Pinkham Sr. have worked together for years, talking to people and actually writing. And hold up that one. Alan has a chapter in Alvin Josephi's last book, Lewis and Clark Through Indian Eyes. And then together they wrote Lewis and Clark Among the Nez Perce. And so they have made, they know this territory very, very well. And some of you have met Alan Jr. up at the Josephi Center carving canoes, right? Alan's been in all kinds of official positions with the tribe, with national organizations involving Indians. I think you were on the board of NMI.
And ATNI.
Yeah, okay. National Congress of American Indians, if you didn't get that one. The first and still the strongest lobbying group for Indians in the country, probably? Yeah. Okay, well, I'm just going to turn it over to them. And they, as I said, they've done this in different iterations and many times. And the final thing to say to you guys, I moved here in 1971. In 1971, if we would have announced this session, we might have got 3 or 4. The interest by individuals and by agencies in tribal history and tribal culture has ratcheted up considerably. So, thank you much for coming, and take it away, Steve and Alan.
I'm going to yield the floor to my elder.
Thanks, Alan. You know, I taught a semester's length class on Nez Perce tribal history. To my knowledge, it's the only one in the United States, the only one in the world that you know, we spent a whole semester on Nez Perce tribal history. So when Rich calls us up and tells us, oh yeah, and you got an hour to tell your story. I'm used to doing this in a semester, and everyone's looking at the speaker. I'm used to everybody's taking notes, because there'll be a quiz later, you know. So. But I do appreciate the introduction, and I wanted to tell you that I've never lived in Wallowa County, but my roots kind of come back to northeastern Oregon for a long time. I was born on Pine Creek and educated in Umatilla County, Oregon. And we always came on vacations to the Imnaha, where we camped at Indian Crossing and couldn't sleep at night. The salmon were so noisy in the river at that time that it was actually in your tent noisy from just all the thrashing and stuff going on in the river from the salmon. And I'm ashamed to say this, but we shot some of those with the .22 and threw them out on the bank and wrapped them in tin foil with onions and put them in the coals. and it was a wonderful time before the dams, and a lot of fish. And then we came over here deer hunting. And then I had an uncle by marriage that owned the ranch that's the conservation ranch now out of Finley Buttes. His name was Buzz Fisk. I don't know if that name means anything to anybody, but it took 2 days to ride around that ranch when I was a kid. And then Alan and I ended up going as speakers out there to the conservation ranch, and I said, you know, this place looks familiar to me somehow. And then we went in the house, and there's that water spout. If you know the ranch house out on that conservation ranch, the water comes out right behind the stove. You know, that's the way to keep your water running all winter. Put the pipe right behind the wood stove. And as soon as I saw that, now I know why this ranch looks familiar. I used to stay out on this ranch when I was a kid with my Uncle Buzz. And and then I had a father-in-law, first marriage, and who was the ranger up at Wallowa Lake State Park. And so, you know, I just, this has been like the second home to me for a long, long time. And it still is. I love it here. Coming over today, Alan and I just can't stop saying wow, you know, and I've been saying wow since 1943. So anyway, but very early on, my grandfather that raised me bought me this little book, and I happened to grab this off the shelf last night. Anybody seen this book? Oh yeah, this is a great little book. And there's so many phony baloney little books out there on tribal history that I love this one, because you don't have to look through these drawings very much to realize this guy, Dean Bullock, he knew what he was drawing, and he knew what he was writing about. There's some technical academic errors in this book, but I don't care. I still love the book, and it makes you love tribal history. If you're not familiar with this book, it's a great little book. You know, my grandpa bought it for me when I was 11 years old, and I don't know, this is my 4th or 5th copy of it. You know, it's a great book. Okay. Well, half my time's up already. Any questions so far? The war. I mean, who likes to talk about the war? I hate talking about the war when I got in class. You know, my classes were mixed, about half Nez Perce, half Totokan, you know, and half white. You know, a lot of the kids in my class over there had relatives that were killed out on Camas Prairie by the 2nd Salmon River Raid. I had other students in the class whose people shot those people. And so, you know, it's not like talking about Roman history or something, you know, ancient stuff where everybody's chopping at each other with short swords. We're talking about people who remember people who shot people, and it's painful as hell. And so I didn't like talking about it. Just one experience I had, my wife and I were hunting elk up near the Montana-Idaho border, and a snowstorm was coming in, and we were tearing our teepee down, and there weren't any other hunters around, and evening was coming, and we tore the cover off the teepee, and just the poles were there. We had a little flickering fire still going to warm our hands up as you're rolling up your cold, frozen, you know, elk hunting equipment. And all of a sudden it hit me, you know, a chill wind hit me, and I thought, this is exactly like Bear Paws. This is exactly like October back in 1877, and a bunch of your relatives are dead, and you've got them buried in shallow graves. A bunch of other people took off, you don't know where. You've lost your horses, you've lost your home, and you don't know if you're ever going to have another meal again or ever see your loved ones again. What a son of a bee to talk about. You know, it just hurts, it's painful. And I hated it so much, especially talking about Big Hole. You know that story, on August 9th in 1877, over there in western Montana on the creek, you know, that runs into the Ruby, that runs by through Wisdom, Montana. And you think the war is over, the shooting's behind you, and then, you know, the army opens up on you, shooting low into the teepees, and, you know, you lose 80-some people, and some of them are your best fighters, but you also, you know, lose the women and kids. And some of the officers said, be careful, you know, it's in the dark, don't shoot any women and kids. And other officers said, nits make lice, now's your opportunity. And the Indians had just come through, the Nez Perce had just come through Bitterroot Valley and saw their old friends and traded for ammunition, traded for flour. And the shooting's all over, they think, the war's all over, they think. And then this terrible, terrible tragedy And some of those little kids were struck in the head by rifle butts. Some of those babies were killed that way. And in the meantime, I started teaching the class, but I married into the tribe. My wife is full-blood Nez Perce, and we've been married for over 30 years. And one of the offshoots of this is that I have grandchildren who are enrolled. I'm not enrolled. I'm a white guy. I'm a Evans from Wales. Where Wales is. That's where my people came from. And someone from Scotland and a few from Germany. The mix. But now suddenly I've got a granddaughter, and she's adorable, and was adorable. She's grown up and still adorable in my eyes, but she's not 2 anymore. But at the time I was teaching the class too, I got up and I hated to talk about Big Hole, but here we are, we got to talk about it. But I tried to lighten the mood by, here, look at my wallet here, I'll show you something, class. Look at this, isn't she cute? This is my granddaughter. So everybody's, oh, she is so cute. Little Alana Teekapoo, she is so sweet. 2 years old. And then I started talking about, we had to do it. So we get to the Battle of the Big Hole, and I thought about my granddaughter. And we had some baseball heroes in my class, some home run hitters. Who wants to take a hold of a barrel of 45-70 Springfield rifle and take a little swing at my granddaughter? That's what people did. They came right out of the timber, they went right across the creek, they tore into the village, they fired their rifles into the teepees, and there was no time to reload, and they started taking care of the Indian problem on a personal level. Well, who wants to do that? It got really quiet in class, by the way. I got really quiet in class. I think, who's going to mess with my granddaughter? You better not do that. And I was telling Alan about one of the most racist friends I ever had. Lived down in Whitebird, Idaho. And he's always bad-mouthing, people of color. And that all came to a screeching halt. This guy, did a 180. What the heck? And I won't tell you his name, but he's gone now anyway. But what happened was his son married into the tribe. And his son and his wife had a baby girl. And so this guy, who was such a horrible racist, now does this 180. You better not say anything about the Nez Perces, because you're talking about my granddaughter now. It changes everything. And that's kind of where it looks like we're going in this community and all over the larger community. Who is what? You ever go into Ancestry.com? Well, like I told you, I was pretty convinced I'm a Welshman, and Scott Irish, maybe a little bit of German. Well, I found out a couple of other things. Uh-oh. Who was the milkman? That's what I want to know. Because they circle, if you've ever gone to Ancestry.com, they circle where all your ancestors are from. And so they got, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and then Africa. There's an other, and I punch other on the computer, other, and it's Africa. Oh, there must be some Evanses from Africa. And it said Native America, and I went, what? And I thought, oh boy, I'm going to find out I'm Nez Perce. I can get enrolled, I can go hunting, and I can get medical service. No, it wasn't that, darn it. It was a circle from El Paso down to Los Angeles. And, there's, 1/2 of 1% is Africa, and then 1/2 of 1% is whatever. So, who are we? What are we? It goes back to a lot of things. Some of it goes back to war. Alan and I know there was a Clark in the war. There was a Clark that was taken prisoner after the Bear Paws. We can't talk about the whole war here today, so I'm just, venting my feelings about it. I'm not going to try and quote you any academic anything. I just tell you to buy the book and look at the bibliography in the back of the book, and that save us some time. But anyways, there was a Clark there, there was a red-headed Nez Perce who fought against the United States Army. His father was a former captain in the United States Army who was one of the Clark of the Clark-Lewis expedition. against the United States Army. There was, Idaho's first homesteader was a guy named William Craig, and he had 2 sons. One of them went over to Pendleton when the war broke out and remained there, and there's still a bunch of Craigs over there. One of them had the name Red Spy. He picked up arms against the United States. The son of Idaho's first homesteader fought against the United States Army. Clark, the son of Captain Clark, fought against the United States Army. You know, one of the interviews I did was with a guy named Don Johnson. And Don Johnson was part Nez Perce, but he wasn't enrolled, but he was a descendant of John Miller Whitehawk. And when he was a young man, John Miller Whitehawk, who was still alive in the early 40s, took him out of school and took him around the Pacific Northwest. And took him into the mountains, into the Blue Mountains, and into the Bitterroot Mountains, and into Canada. They went all over the place. And one of the things that John Miller told him was, when I see that flag, it scares the hell out of me. You know, we're proud of our flag, we're proud of our country. But I'm just telling you, there's another perspective out there. This old man, John Miller, who had been a young warrior in 1877, told Don Johnson, who was a veteran of Korea himself and is now deceased, but Don told me the old man had strong feelings. He'd see that flag, he'd kind of flinch. It scared the crap out of him because he knew what it could mean. The cannon fire could come at any time, and there goes the house, and there goes your relatives. So that went on. There were 5 major battles. There was Whitebird, Clearwater, Big Hole, Canyon Creek, and then the Bear's Paw or Bear Paws. And that's an amazing 5 major battles. And then there were all kinds of little skirmishes and other things that went on at Cottonwood, First Salmon River Raid, Second Salmon River Raid. Then, of course, there was Fort Fizzle, you know, on the Lolo Trail. The Army tried to block them, and they rode around the Army. That fizzled out, so now they still have that Fort Fizzle thing along the road. It's a legacy. It's still strong. There are people, like I said, it's not like talking about ancient history. It's current history. And for people, a lot of people around, it wasn't that long ago. And so it's part of our legacy. It's part of what makes America what it is, the bad and the good. I don't know if you remember Gary Cooper. Some of you too young to remember Gary Cooper, but in the last film that he did, it was a documentary called The Real West. And I loved Cooper, but anyway, in this documentary, he did such a great job. After he described the Indian Wars and stuff, he said, America is, blood is mixed on the battlefield. You know, there's white blood, there's Indian blood on all these battlefields. And for all that happened, and for the emotion and for the pain, America is rich. That's a part of the richness of who we are today. And if we can take that and build on it, then the future is brighter because of what we went through. And we should be building on that and not on the bitterness that is created by it. So, you know, I'd like to have you for the rest of the semester, and we could really get into this war business, but we don't have it. It's time's up, so hey, appreciate it. Thank you.
Dr. Melee. My Nez Perce name is Paket Haifatin, and my English name, of course, is Alan Pinkham. We got the Pinkham name when the allotment process came into being, and my grandfather took the name Pinkham because there was a sheriff in Asotin County that was named Pinkham that he knew, so he took the name Pinkham for the Allotment Act. So that's how we ended up with a good English name. But to get back to some of the things that were occurring, You know, I'm familiar here with Joseph, Oregon as well. The first time I came here was 1946 or 1947, when the rodeo just started here in Joseph, just after the war. And we camped over there by the canal where the rodeo ground was at. And we were invited over. And so that's why I'm acquainted here. And my father knew Grace Bartlett, of course, and she lived here with her husband. And my father would tell me stories, mostly about treaties, a little about prophecies. And he would tell me that he would listen to three old men in about 1903, 1904, when he was about 7 or 8 years old. And he could remember some of the stories that these three old men would talk about. One was his uncle, Nishnakeu, and he was a descendant of Cutnose, who met Lewis and Clark in 1805. So historically, I'm tied into some of this history through our family, through Cutnose, and of course also Looking Glass and whatnot, the other that became known as Old Joseph and Young Joseph. I'm a descendant of Sarah, who was a sister of Joseph. And my mother was a Blackie, and my father was a descendant of Cutnose as well, and of Chief Timothy's band on the El Poway. So my family ties go into the history since about 1750, is about as far as I can trace it back. Through Red Bear, the first Red Bear. He was killed by Shoshone Bannocks on a Salmon River. And he left some descendants who met Lewis and Clark, who was known as Red Bear. So I'm also a descendant of Red Bear. So, through learning some of this tribal history through my father and some other elders that I've spoken to, I find out that the first treaty we made with the United States was in 1806 along Lawyers Creek, just above Cami, Idaho, along Lawyers Creek, what became known as Lawyers Creek. That was the first verbal agreement we had with Lewis and Clark, who were representatives of the United States, who were actually on a military expedition counting Indians from St. Louis west. And of course, we were counted as well. So they estimated that Nez Perce amounted to between 6,000 and 7,000. And that was in 1805. By 1900, our numbers were only 1,300 Nez Perce. But even prior to Lewis and Clark, we had also suffered at least 2 epidemics that wiped out whole villages along the Salmon and the Snake and the Clearwater. We lost thousands of our tribal people to diseases. So at the time of the war, we were somewhere between 5 and 1,300. Now, we agreed with Lewis and Clark that yes, we will be peaceful and friendly as long as you treat us the same way. That was the agreement we made. Well, we adhered to that agreement up until 1877. The first Nez Perce was killed in 1813 at the mouth of Palouse River by a trader, ironically named Clark, from Canada. It was just an argument over a silver goblet at the mouth of Palouse River. Of course, the expedition of Clark was heavily armed, and we weren't, of course. We didn't have but maybe just a few muzzle loaders, trade muzzle loaders, which weren't very accurate. But this expedition was well armed, and there were probably a couple of dozen, maybe 3 dozen of them. So the argument was over who took the goblet. And nobody would fess up to it from the tribal people. So they chose one Nez Perce and hung him. They put a tripod up and hung him. That was the first killing of a Nez Perce after we would agree with Lewis and Clark that we would be peaceful and friendly. We didn't go to war at that time. This was in 1813. And a relationship then was between trappers and traders that came into our territory. Mackenzie and others. We didn't like Mackenzie because he wouldn't pay our price that we wanted for horses. So he moved his trading post to Wallowas. So that's some of the things of the relationships that we're building. But yet, from 1813 to 1877, Alvin Josephi counted about 28 or 29 Nez Perce who were murdered during that period. But we still kept the peace until 1877. And there was conflict, of course, with General Miles and Howard, principally Howard. Well, Joseph and the Wallowa people were adhering to that. They would finally agree to cross over to Lapway from Joseph Canyon. And they crossed at Duckbar, of course, and then went through the hullabaloo at Lapway and agreed that, yeah, we'll come across. Well, the Salmon River was flooded, of course, in springtime. They had to leave their cattle. They brought most of the horses across. And they ended up in Whiteburg. And there's 3 young men, Wallowas, Sarpsis, Elpil, and Wahike, Wetyetis. These 3 young men, 2 of those were my relatives. They were cousins to my grandfather, John Pinkham. His Indian name was Ilu Silikati. Well, the 3 men agreed. The youngest one was Wetyetis Wahike. His translation of his name was Swan Nicholas. He was only 16. He was a horse holder with the other 2 men. And Wallowas' father was previously murdered on Whitebird Creek. And when the camp moved down, well, they were actually camped at Tolo Lake, but then Wallowas and Red Moxitops and Swan Nicholas went looking for the man that killed Wallowas' father the previous year. And he lived at Whitebird. And his name was Larry Ott. A lot of people don't agree that this is the name of the man that actually killed Wallowas' father. But we know it in our tribal history as Larry Ott. Well, the 3 men arrived at Whitebird Creek and couldn't find Larry Ott. He suddenly got word that some Indians were looking for him and he disappeared. So the 3 young men, well, decided, well, we still feel to be vindicated for the death of Wallowas' father. So they went up the river on a salmon and killed several traders and settlers up there. And that actually started the shooting war of 1877, which were my relatives. Wallowas was my father's cousin. In those days, we called cousins brothers. So actually, it was my grandfather's brother. And Red Moxon Tops was the son of Yellow Bull, and who Yellow Bull was our relative. So Red Moxon Tops is also our cousin to our grandfather. I don't know how closely we were related to Wagetlas Wahai, Swan Nicholas, but we were probably related in some way. So these three young men, they were the ones that actually started the shooting war of 1877 because they were seeking revenge for the killing of Wallach's father. So that's how the shooting war started. But I would recall that up to that time, nearly 36 Nez Perces were murdered. One was another relative of mine, his name was Blackie. He was killed over on Joseph Plains. So there was a number of atrocities that were committed against us, but yet we never went to war. Joseph agreed, yes, I'll come to the Lapwai Reservation from Oregon. And he was doing that, he was complying. But these three young men started a shooting war. So from then on, the three young men agreed that we will always stick together and we'll be out of the fighting all through whatever encounters that we may come up to with the United States Army. And they agreed to that. So they went through the Battle of Clearwater, then through Fort Fizzle, and when they came to Big Hole, they were still adhering to this agreement. Of course, they were surprised in a camp that morning at dawn when the shooting started. Well, Wallachitz had a young woman, a young wife with him, and when they woke up with the bullets going through their tent, they found his rifle. It was a .45-70 Springfield that he had picked up, or someone else had picked up after the Battle of Whitebird. This is the way the Nez Perce became well armed. They picked up the rifles dropped by the soldiers or the ones that were killed. And so we possessed somewhere between 30 to 40 Springfield rifles in that manner. So we were heavily armed at this time. Before, at the Battle of Whitebird, many of our people only had bows and a few muzzle loaders that were smoothbore. They weren't rifled, so they weren't very accurate. And there was only 2 repeaters in possession of Nez Perce at that time. One was Yellow Wolf, and I can't remember the other one, but they were probably Model 73 Winchesters, repeaters. They held something like 15 rounds. And there was only one of those at that Whitebird Battle. And I think it was Yellow Wolf, he finally got his lever action rifle. So he was very effective then, from then on. But most of the Nez Perce were armed with .45-70s now, and at the Battle of Big Hole, Wallachitz had picked up this rifle or acquired it from someone. And so we used that .45-70 in defense of his wife and the camp. I went up to the Big Hole to observe where Wallachitz, my relative, died. It was also written by McWhorter, how he died. So he came out of the tent, and he found a little log. It was only about 3 or 4 inches in diameter. He laid behind it, and his wife came right behind him and laid down behind him. Well, he shot a soldier coming across the creek, but then more were coming across the creek, and he finally killed. The bullet went down through his throat and into his body. His wife, seeing him being shot, picked up his rifle and shot the soldier that killed her husband. And so that's how he died. Well, the soldier finally pushed out of the camp at Big Hole. Then Sergeant Hill Pill, his partner, was at the siege point on that little bench where the soldiers took refuge and they dug trenches in that little flat there. And I went up there and I found the stone that was the shelter for red moccasin tops. It was only about enough to cover the soldiers and head of someone that lays behind him. And this is what red moccasin tops took his shelter behind. It was only about 40 to 50 yards away from the soldiers' trenches. And then someone shouted to him, "Your partner, Wallowas, was killed in camp." And after a few minutes of fighting, he said, "Well, I'm going to go the same way as my partner, Wallowas." And this is what he shouted to the other warriors that were gathered around him and down over the bank of the soldiers' trenches. So he gets up and he starts running towards the trenches, and of course, he doesn't make it to the trenches. He's killed maybe 15 or 20 feet from the trenches. So that's how he died. Well, the father of red moccasin tops, Yellowbow, he says, "I want those things that are on my son where he's laying out there. I want those things." There was a talisman around his neck and a white fur piece that his father wanted. And he told the warriors around him, if someone would volunteer to go out there and pick up those items, you can have the white robe. But give me the talisman. And maybe the rifle. He also had a .45-70 also. So one volunteered to go up and do that. Well, he was killed trying to get these items off of red moccasin tops. And another one volunteered and went up there and did the same thing. Well, he was successful. He picked up the talisman and a robe and the rifle and brought him back and gave him to Yellowbow. So from there on, they gave up on the soldiers and started to move the camp and go into Yellowstone National Park. Previously, Yellowstone National Park was established in 1873, I believe. And so the rifle, both rifles go all the way through the war. From there to Canyon Creek, to the crossing of Missouri, and then to Bears Paw. And then you have to surrender. The only one that was left was Swan Necklace. Well, he survived the war. He finally comes back to the reservation. They spent some time in Oklahoma, and of course the other group went to Canada. Well, Swan Necklace comes back. People recognize him. They don't point him out. They know who he is. People know that he was with Joseph during the war. Well, they don't point him out. So he goes to the Umatilla Reservation and takes up the name John Minfield. And there he survives. And he has a family in Umatilla, the Minfields. My nephew is a Minfield. So I have ties from different directions to my various relatives. So he survives it. He's the only one of the three that actually started the shooting war. Well, my grandfather, he was also in this war. He was from the Alpawa band. Of course, he went to Tolo Lake to race horses during that time period that they were camped at Total Lake. So he gets caught up in a conflict. And he goes along with his cousin walleye kids, but doesn't participate with the three. Well, he survives these battles all the way to Big Hole. And there, he survives that battle as well. But the elders tell him, you go back to Lapway with these 5 young boys. They're all younger than he. He was about 16 or 17 at that time. So he was the leader of the 5 boys. And they came back from Big Hole. They come get the Lapway. And of course, they were quickly pointed out, as those are fighting, they came from the fighting group. So they were arrested and they were sent to Vancouver, Washington, and spent some time there. But eventually my grandfather ends up in Oklahoma, in exile as well. So these are my family ties. I'm sure other Nez Perce have similar stories as well. But families were split right down the middle. Father on the fighting side, the sons remaining as a reservation Indian. The Black Eagles, my mother's family was that way. Black Eagles fought with Joseph, but another Black Eagle was a messenger for Howard, a runner. So there was a very strong split. Who is to survive the onslaught of the Soyapo? And it divided families that way. It was a civil conflict between tribal people. What should we do? How do we survive all this stuff? Well, that's all.
So we've got some time before lunch. Steve, a couple of things occurred to me. Number one, Ellen mentioned the hanging. Okay? With the Cayuse War, we ended up with the sacrificial hangings. Why was this hanging business? How did the Army and the hanging, and how prevalent was that in Indian wars and in dealings with tribes before the Nez Perce War? Was that a common thing?
Lincoln, there were 300 and some that were going to get hanged, and he commuted it all except for the 38, the Minnesota War, the Civil War.
How many of you know about the Mankato hangings?
Yeah, Rich was asking about the hangings, the murders, and what my father would tell me, he would say they would hang Nez Perce people 2 or 3 at a time, just to make a point. That you're a reservation Indian, you're here, you stay there, you're an Indian, uncivilized, unenlightened, savages. That's what he was told when he was a boy. But he also met a white guy that he learned, my father learned many things from this white man. He taught my father carpentry, how to measure and build with timbers. And he met another one that told him, says, well, I know what's happening to your people. This white man told him, says, they're trying to put you in your place and keep you there and not let you come outside. You've got to be an Indian and stay on the reservation. That's what's going to happen to you, and that's the way it's going to be. In the meantime, these hangings and killings were taking place as well. One of my mother's relatives was accused of stealing cattle on Joseph's Plains, and he was shot by a rancher and killed. He was one of those that were murdered during that time period. And of course, when that case was brought to the courts, it was dismissed. That same kind of thing happened to the Chinese on Deep Creek here. I was involved in a memorial of the 33 Chinese that were killed at Deep Creek on the Snake. And if you ever go to that memorial, it's right on the banks of the Salmon River at Deep Creek. That memorial was written in 3 languages. The province that most of these Chinese people came from is written in their language on that stone. And it's written in Nez Perce on that stone. And it's also written in English. They flew that stone in by helicopter to put it in place. And we invited as many Chinese as we could find, and we did find some that came from the region in China that some of these Chinese people were from. And they appreciated that. And we know the story behind it, of course, and the involvement of some of the people here. And none of those people, only one went to court, I think, and that was dismissed. So the attitude in those days was very negative. And even the politics of today is similar. You wouldn't believe that would ever come to that, but unfortunately it has. But we can overcome many of these things. Some of the things that when I was involved with Lewis and Clark Bicentennial, is that the one thing that we spoke of all the time during this Lewis and Clark Bicentennial, when Lewis and Clark came among the Nez Perce, they said peace and friendship. That's why we come out here, to be peaceful and friendly with the indigenous people on this continent. That's what they were saying. So we agreed with that. So through the bicentennial, we wanted to rebuild on that concept as well, 200 years later. And many of the people appreciated that. Because you get bias and prejudice, and, it's still not as great as it used to be. And you can realize that with the Wallowa property and what goes on there. I think that's a great step for not only this community, but Nez Perce as well, and other Indians who live in this area. So I think that's a tremendous effort. Otherwise, very little would be occurring in any kind of relationship. So I do appreciate it. I think it's well done. Thank you.
Got time for a couple more. Steve,
Yeah.
you want to add anything there?
Well, we got a few minutes. Anybody has any question, that old story, everything you wanted to know about, but we're afraid to ask. Let's see that. Yeah, here you go.
I would like to call Mount Howard its original name, but I don't know what it is. You know what it is?
General Howard. Otis.
The mountain.
Mount Howard. Yeah, they named that after General Howard.
Yeah, I know, but what was it? What was it originally called? You know?
Don't know.
I
I know,
Has anybody looked at Oregon Geographic Names? Should have the story there.
I don't know what the original name was, but in general, the Wallowas did have specific names.
Sure.
And Reverend David Miles was one of our language instructors who came in a horse and buggy over to this country and was left up on a mountain above the Lostine for his Wyak camp. And he told me that there was a separate language related to the Wallowa High Country that was all a spiritual use language. It wasn't a kid's language or anything, and it wasn't a language used ordinarily. It's when you talked about the High Wallowas, it was in a religious context, and the names were all different in this special language than they were in ordinary talk. And one of the specific things I do remember he said was the name for these mountains in general, the Mech was the name, Mech Sem, and then, but in a spiritual context, it was Kimolikin. And that was the little thing that he told me that I did incorporate into one of the chapters of the first book I did. But Reverend Miles is gone now. He was a language teacher at Lewis Clark State that my wife and I recruited years ago, and he's passed on now. But we still have all our notes and some great stuff in there. And his, some of you know this golden antlered ground squirrel, and he told me, you can't talk about this till I'm gone, but that was his wag hour, was it called? Not a mutskoy, but a mutskoy is a regular chipmunk, but the golden antlered ground squirrel is a different name, the slip. Anyway, that was his spirit power, and he received that on that mountain between Lostine and that first big bald ridge there, Lostine on the left side. And he spent 3 nights up there, not sleeping, just drinking water, no food, no sleep, until this golden antlered ground squirrel came to him and talked to him. And in the rest of his life, there were different crises in his life, and each time he had a crisis, that ground squirrel would come and talk to him. And one little story he told me that I thought was great, that had to do with the power of these mountains, was that he was drinking, he was a college graduate, but he was Indian, he couldn't get a job, he was a coach, he couldn't get a job coaching, he was drinking, he pulled off alongside the road, loaded his revolver, and stumbled out into the sagebrush somewhere down in Central Oregon, and was going to shoot himself. And this golden antlered ground squirrel came to him and said, "You fool, you stupid person, you are just about to get hired and be a basketball coach and a school teacher. Put that pistol away and grow up." And he did, and he got the job, and he became a school teacher, and he was a very successful basketball coach, and then he became a Presbyterian minister, and anyway, he died of old age. But that's one of the stories he told me about his encounter with this golden antlered ground squirrel, and a couple other great little stories. But anyway, what Alan mentioned, to me, in a national context, this war was one of the last wars. You know, it was, and very important, this war came right after the Sioux War of '76. I mean, this was only a year after Little Bighorn, so, you know, people were nervous. I looked at some newspaper accounts. They sandbagged Seattle after the Battle of Whiteburg. They sandbagged Seattle. Is there any paranoia in American history? I mean, Richard Hofstadter wrote a book called The Paranoid Style of American Politics. It's always something. If it's not the Redskins, later it's the Reds, you know, and now it's the socialists and the Guatemalan refugees. They're all going to get us, you know, they're going to devour us, they're going to eat us up, they're going to change us forever. We've had it, we're finished. You know, we're not. No, we're not. Anyway,
Did Custer seal the Nez Perce's fate? Basically, when Custer ate his lunch there, did that paranoia?
did he have time for lunch? I don't remember. I know he wore an arrow shirt. That's the only thing I remember. I don't know, but it definitely was a part of the national scheme, you know. And Giuseppe was an advisor on that film, you know, Little Big Man, where Custer has political ambition. Well, there's no doubt about it that many of these generals, you know, did have political ambition. I mean, you know, we can name them: Grant, you know, Sherman, and so on. They all, or not all, but many of them had political. Some of them still have political ambition. What do we know? We're way out here. We're far, far from the center of real reality. You know, you have to get into the beltway to get to reality. Anyway, so I just wanted to mention one more thing about that the war. Is that it's not often brought out, but if you analyze each battle, every fight, every major fight in the war was a defensive fight. It involved military attacks on women and children. You know, Whiteburg, defense of the village. Clearwater, defense of the village. Big Hole, very obviously, defense of the village. Canyon Creek, women and kids are in travelways, pack horses crossing the Yellowstone River, heading up, you know, that canyon over there by Billings, out of Laurel, Montana. You know, if you've you've gone over to that site. What a place to hold the military off, you know. A couple of repeaters and a couple of guys with guts, and nobody's getting through that place. I mean, it's, you know, there's rocks big enough to hide your horse herd in there, and the biggest houses to get behind. Good bullet stoppers. Then, of course, at the last major conflict there at Bear Paws, defensive again. You know, this is not, the people were trying to get away. They're trying to avoid trouble. It's defensive. That's what I wanted to mention that. Of course, we're going to get to the exile right after lunch, and we find more people died in the exile from neglect than died of bullets during the war. That's not a happy statistic, but it's true, a true statistic. Yeah.
Did the Nez Perce have scouts or people that they would put behind them to track the army and maybe?
Yeah, that's right. The question was, did they have scouts? Did they have? Yeah, they had. They became famous in this conflict for the use of advanced scouts, flankers, rear scouts, and that was only ignored a couple of times, and they paid a heavy price for it. One reason, you know, a big hole, that they thought the fighting was over. They didn't. Right. And there were actually some young men who wanted to go on the back trail and scout. Now, I mean, I think about sci-fi movies here. You know, what things you could do differently. If you were a non-Indian and a friend of the Indians, and you knew that everybody's packing up to make a sneak attack on the Indian village, and you could go up and turn the clock back, wouldn't you want to sneak out of there and ride ahead and, hey, guess what's coming? You know?
Yeah, I also want to ask, I think it was in Hear Me My Chiefs, I read that maybe when the Nez Perce arrived in the Big Hole Valley, there was some discussion about the best place to camp and maybe argument about a vision that there was a need to move to a safer
Yes,
spot.
that was in Hear Me My Chiefs or in Yellow Wolf. It was one of McWhorter's works. All those McWhorter papers, by the way, are available online through the MASC, Manuscripts, Archives, and Special Collections, Pullman, Washington, WSU Library. You can, I'm not good at it, but I just drive to Pullman anyway. Go there. But those papers are there. All those stories are there in note form that McWhorter got, you know, as he sat down in these little camps. You know, the Indians came down from Nespelin and then over from Lapway to work in the hops in Yakima Valley, and a lot of them camped on McWhorter's ranch, which was right there in what was called North Yakima, where the fairground, near where the fairgrounds is today. And so they sat there and told these stories, and here's Interpreter Hart, and here's Yellow Wolf. He's telling the story. Interpreter Hart's telling it in English, and McWhorter's over here writing it down on a piece of paper and in a tablet. And those tablets are all in the McWhorter, page 55 of those archives and special collections.
So how do you pronounce his first name?
Lucullus. It's a hard C.
Lucullus.
The only place in Scottish history where they don't pronounce the C's hard is if you're from Boston and you're cheering for a certain basketball team. It's Celtic. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I could probably get a whipping saying it the wrong way.
There you go.
Yes?
I don't really have a question, but I grew up in Florida.
In Florida?
Florida, Oregon.
Oh, Florida. Oh, my
Near where
God.
you
That's
know-
different than Florida.
Yeah. Quite different. A little colder.
Yeah.
A little drier. I just want to say this, that all of us who grew up out there knew these stories, not to the level of detail
Yeah.
that you guys are telling, but we wouldn't talk about it.
Yeah.
There was a guilt,
Yes.
and I think there were, Lisa probably knows about this too,
Uh-huh.
but there was a guilt, and I am deeply thankful that all of you are here, and we're talking about this out loud 30 years after.
Yeah.
You know,
Well,
so thanks for
you
coming.
know, I had classes that and this is something everybody goes through. You go through a guilt thing, and I got through it, I still go through it and everything, and then it suddenly hit me, you know, my concern isn't for the people that feel guilt, it's for the people that don't give a single damn about guilt and think they're totally exonerated because of whatever, you know. I mean, we're all in this together, and a lot of ugly things have happened along the trail. Not with this, you know, everything we're looking at, you know. I mean, look at the news just recently and what happened at the synagogue and all of that. You know, well, I'm not a Jew, I don't care. Well, I mean, I used to be a Methodist though, and I still have family that are Methodists. I'm a Methodist alumni. And, you know, I don't want, if it happens, you know, if it happens one place, it can happen any place. And it is happening every place. I mean, you think little Moscow, Idaho, university town, I mean, we had shootings on campus up there. We had a shooting in the courthouse in Moscow. We had a police officer shot in Moscow. You know, little hick agricultural university town in the far west, isolated from the big city and everything. And you know, it's everywhere. It's in the human heart, and so you know, we're concerned about it, or we should be concerned about it everywhere, and especially in our own heart. The only place we got any real control. Okay. Anyway.
Real quickly, what's the role of history in our processing that concern?
What was that again?
What's the role? What's the role of history? What does history serve us?
Okay, I'm glad you asked that. You know what? I'm a preacher's kid, so I got to mention Matthew here. We know what it says in Matthew about, and I take this to heart, even though I am a graduate of, I'm church alumni. But anyway, the truth shall set you free, and it's always. And Alan and I struggle with this. You know, when the hardest part of our book, I thought, was when at the very end they sent the manuscript back to us and said, "You guys have to summarize this. You got to say what happened in Nez Perce history after Lewis and Clark." And I go, "What?" Yeah, you got to write just one little short chapter telling everything that happened and the major things. And yeah, we spent a semester on that, you know, or half a semester on that. And so it's alarming to me that, you know, always that the non-Indian writes another book about 10,000 years of tribal history, and 90% of what's written about the Nez Perce is written about 1 year, the writing and the shooting part, you know. And so I'm concerned about that. And we sent that, so we revised the chapter, we sent it back to them, and they sent it back to us for another revision, said, couldn't you keep it down, keep a lid on it a little bit, give us a milquetoast version? And now I said, huh, what? That was our milquetoast version. You know, it's the role in the film. You want the truth? You don't want to hear it. You know, there's too much blood and rape, you know, in the real story. You don't want to know that much detail. It's not something that'll ease people's minds and make them feel more comfortable. It's not going to happen. So they said, oh, well, okay, and they backed off. But that was a very difficult chapter to summarize, to try and weigh the words. But what we tried to do was the role of the historian, follow the truth where it leads you. You know, it might not be comfortable. It might be like, here's your dose of castor oil. Remember that? Take this tonight. It tastes like H, but you're going to feel better in the morning. And that's my prescription for history is, you know, we take it as it comes. We got to deal with it. It might be distasteful. It might be bitter. We might not like it, but you'll feel better in the morning. So I hope that answers your question. This isn't Halloween and these aren't chocolates, so. Yeah.
Kathleen, are we ready for the lunch then?
Break lunch?
And also, Kathleen, by the way, Kathleen, we can, some of you who haven't been here every time, Kathleen actually is the one who raised the money and put this. Benjamin said over there, well, maybe I was wrong. Maybe in 1975, he thought his dad would have attended, and I knew Benjamin's dad, and I think he's right. His dad would have been here. He would have stopped at the book loft and picked up a book on jazz of the 20s or 30s. I think he's probably right. There were people around at that time who were interested. I mean, Alvin Giuseppe was living here part-time. The issue was more, did anybody think to invite Nez Perce people here to talk about their history and to talk about their culture? We invited them to Chief Joseph Days to ride in the parade and to put up their teepee, but to have have them actually talk about their history and culture. I don't think we were ready for it. I might be wrong. Anyway, Steve and Alan have things figured out now. I would hope that maybe some of you had other questions that you raised at your tables. And Kathleen always tells me she wants to be able to have discussion. It's hard with a group of 50 or 45, 50. But if you do had some questions over what happened the first part, kind of save them at the end, and Steve and Alan will try to leave a little room for that. But they've got their show that they alter it. I've seen different versions. They alter it with the topic, but they work very well together. And here they go again.
What a good lunch. I hope I don't get that on the microphone. Anyway, that first part, the war, which, you know, we didn't cover. How can you cover the war? It's too much. But we got some things started on the discussion about the war. Now we're going to talk about the end of the war and what happened then, the exile and the return. And it's a complicated story, and a lot of mention is not made of it in many of the accounts. If you're familiar with a lot of the printed literature on Nez Perce, much of it ends with, and Joseph dies and tips over in the campfire, and that's the end of that's the sequel to the story, and then there is no more Nez Perce history after the death of Joseph and after the return from Indian Territory. And actually, it's like all interest in American Indians, sort of ends. The buffalo were gone, Joseph is dead, so, what's to talk about? And that's really unfortunate because some of the more interesting aspects of the history is before the war, and an awful lot of history after the war. It's been over 100 years of tribal history. Since the war, it's been, 77, 87, 90, I'm not very good. That was like 130 or 40 years since the war. And a lot has transpired. And so this is a new beginning in a sense after the last of the fighting. First of all, I just want to make a word about the surrender and the surrender speech. Some people, really believe Joseph said, "From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever." That's the part that everybody remembers. It's in the movie, after all, so it must be true. I think it actually is true, but it's a subject of quite a bit of controversy. I can't think of the fellow's name, but there's an academic at LeGrand that made it a specialty of his to look into that. And he also made a specialty of looking at C.E.S. Wood, who was there, who supposedly wrote it down. There's controversy about the speech, but I don't think there's any really controversy about the intent and that there was a talk made. And if you've heard any of the oratory of any of the dreamers or even modern day people in the Longhouse, there's no doubt in my mind that people had those practiced oratorical skills to really move people and really impress people with their words and how they handle them. And I've heard it a lot. I've heard it from my cohort, Alan. When he gets fired up, he's scary. And lots of other tribal leaders who are really good at it, at certain times and places. So I have no doubt that what that speech captured something of the flavor. But what I want to talk about is not the flavor, but the content of the agreement of surrender, which was that it was a negotiated surrender and that it was a conditional surrender. And that the condition was that the tribal people be returned to their homes. So those that lay down their arms and they come in and they get to keep their horses, and there will not be a threat to the United States government anymore, but they will be returned home, and they're going to get some blankets and they're going to get some food and so on. We know that that is why Joseph surrendered. Somebody had to take charge of those who had enough, who could not carry on. We also know that there's another batch of folks who are not going to carry on with any agreement with the Misami Soyapo government, you know, lying white people. How can you surrender to them? Because they'll bullshit you and take your guns and your horses. Anyway, Whitebird was one of these. He's never going to surrender. I have white friends from Whitebird, and they're so proud of Chief Whitebird. We are from Whitebird, we never surrender anything. We're not giving up to the game warden or anybody else, you know. So anyway, it's, you know, that's part of Salmon River tradition. Chief Whitebird never surrenders. And of course he didn't. And a lot of other people who were very capable and still armed and still had a bite, like Yellow Wolf, who shoved his lever action down his leg of his leg, and you know, put his rifle down his buckskin leg, and oh man, that's terrible, isn't it? Was it the cavalry right on cue? No, I don't know. We'll do this. We'll deal with that later. You should know by now to leave that in the car. Anyways, so anyway, they went to Canada. Whitebird did. A lot of Yellow Wolf did. Some of the people. There. Turn the phone off. This is what we should have done to start with. So the thing is, there are still Nez Perce in Canada today. There's still families up there today. I've gone up there. I've gone to a powwow up there, and I meet the people. And one of the announcements, one of the guys at the, you know, doing the talk at the powwow says, everybody from here, from not Alberta, but Saskatchewan, who is Nez Perce related or has Nez Perce family, get up and come out here and dance. And I mean, there was like 15 or 20 elderly guys with blankets wrapped around them, big eagle feather bonnets, that came out and led this group. And behind that, women and kids. And then the announcer says, and remember, with all the people you see out here, there is a basketball tournament up in Lethbridge this weekend. So many of our Nez Perce people are playing basketball. They aren't here tonight, you know. And so these weren't people who were thoroughly Nez Perce, but they knew that their heritage was in part Nez Perce. They knew that there were Nez Perce warriors who took their lever action rifles and who joined with the only major Canadian Indian revolt that they had out on the plains, and shot up a bunch of Mounties pretty good and gave up their lives for a bunch of these Crees who were trying to make their getaway from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who had formed into an army and were in pursuit of them. And these guys had experience with, you know, military, and they had fast horses and fast Winchesters, and they gave up their lives. And there's a monument to them now on Indian land up in Saskatchewan, where these guys were, and I can't remember their names offhand, but they played a role in the later governments of some Piegan people up there and some Crees. They even with the Sioux. Reverend Dave Miles, that I mentioned to you earlier, one of my Seppahet Temanawat, one of my teachers, he told me that, oh yes, I learned Sitting Bull's victory song in the sweat house at Mission Creek in Idaho. I said, what? He said, yes, Jackson Sundown. He come back from up there in Canada, and you know, and later as saddle bronc champion of the world, 1916, Pendleton, Oregon. But he had lived in the lodge with Sitting Bull, and he had learned Sitting Bull's victory song, and he sang it in the sweat house at Sweetwater, Idaho, and little Dave Miles was there, and he learned that song. And we were recording language at the time. He said, if I just had my hand drum, I would sing it for you right now. And oh man, I got to find a hand drum. And I couldn't find one. So anyway, other people have saved that song, but it's amazing the Nez Perces who were there and what they absorbed, and many of them, you know, slipped back down across the border, you know, in later years, and kind of slipped into Lapway or slipped into Pendleton or went to Yakima. you know, where they, someplace you go, someplace where you got relatives, you know. You're not looking for a Motel 6 here, you know. It's one thing you learn on the reservation. You don't stay in hotels, motels much. You got a cousin someplace, and it happens to be you want to visit right when you're going to go to that town, you know. Seattle, you got relatives, Portland, you know, wherever you go, you got friends and relatives, and if they're just close friends, you start calling them relative, and then you have room for me on the couch or someplace. And that's kind of what they did with the Lakota, because they had something in common. They had a big conflict with the United States government, and so that's a lot in common, because them people, you know, Sitting Bull's people, they weren't always friends with the Nez Perce out there in Buffalo country. They, Nez Perce sign for Lakota was cutthroat people. And that's how they thought of them, that's how they talked about them. But this was a different time. They'd had this enemy in common. And so Sundown stayed with the Lakota and got fed by Sitting Bull's wife, and was nurtured there for a few years before he slipped back across the border. So there's Canadian Nez Perces, quite a bunch of them. There's a family called the Warrior family up there. They took the last name Warrior. And I remember one of them's name was Pete Warrior. Anyway, Urban Waters, who used to live in Wallowa County, told me that he was cousins to a bunch of them people in Canada, last name Warrior. And he'd go up and visit them, and he went up to the Calgary Stampede one year and drank beer and signed up for the Saddle Bronc and had a good time and met a bunch of his relatives up there at Calgary. But then a bunch of them also, of course, under Joseph, first thing that government did after they got their weapons away from them was take their horses away from them. They promised he could keep all the saddles, all your Spanish bits, all your spurs, all that good stuff, you know, that goes with horses. They took it and they gave it away, or they burned it. They gave the Crows a bunch of horses for helping fight against the Nez Perces. Some of the local ranchers got horses, and then, you know, and then some of the horses were just abandoned, and, you know, and there were horses that were worn out, and there were horses that were wounded, and so, I mean, this war took a terrific toll on people's material wealth. They lost their cattle in Wallowa County. They lost a lot of their county in a lot of their cattle in what is now Idaho County, Idaho. I mean, I know old timers there, white people who said, when we came into this country, we didn't bring our cattle with us. We just started branding the cattle that were already running in the hills over here. When the Nez Perces had to leave because of the war, they left hundreds, if not thousands, of cattle in the Imnaha country, in the Divide Creek country, over on the Idaho side of Hell's Canyon. And in fact, that's where Joseph and Ollicott were when the war began. They were over there shooting cattle and jerking the meat to, you know, for provisions to move in. So there's all these divisions within the tribe, and then of those that got divided off that fought, those people are divided. Some go to Canada, some go with Joseph. They put them on, they take them cross country in travelway, and the army found that the wounded were doing so much better on travelways, they even took the wounded soldiers and put them on Indian travelways. They traveled along together. They shared meals together, all the way from Bear's Paw down to Miles City, which was then Fort Keogh, on the Yellowstone River. And so then they put them on flat boats, and they took them down, many of them who were wounded, on these big flat boats, formerly used in the fur trade, and they just floated down the river. But they had a bunch of people riding parallel on the bank, and so they camped together at night. And there's a great little story Fred Bond wrote, flatboating on the Yellowstone. And he was a young Army guy, and he was supposed to be captain of one of these flatboats. And there was a really beautiful Nez Perce girl on board this boat, and boy, he really zeroed in on her and thought she was really special. He wrote some really great things about her. But he wrote some other stuff too, and one of the things that he wrote about was there was an old man on this boat, and they got tired of Army rations, so they stopped along the riverbank, and this old man, and he said he fashions a bow. He just gets a chunk of wood off the riverbank, and he makes a bow, and pretty soon he's got some arrows. And then, you know, they're not supposed to be armed or anything because they're prisoners of war. But he said, as they're going down the river, he's shooting beaver with his bow and arrow and throwing them in the boat so that when they land at camp that night, instead of having hardtack and bacon, all moldy bacon and bad crackers, they got beaver tail soup and, you know, some fresh meat, something good to eat. Anyway, Josephi tapped into that, and he quotes Fred Bond quite a bit in his unabridged version of Nez Perce Indians in the Opening of the Northwest, first published in 1965 by Yale University Press, and it's gone through many reprints since then. After they went down, though, they got clear down to Fort Abraham Lincoln, and then they took them and put them on railroad. So I looked up the railroads as they existed in 1877, because I know they ended up going to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Well, you can't get there from there by going on the railroad unless you go to Minneapolis, St. Paul. So I think they put them all on the train. They went to Minneapolis, St. Paul, then they went south from there to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. I've been to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. There's a place there, you know, that's a prison. There's a place there that's an army base. And there's a place down along the river they call Malaria Flats. That's where they put the Nez Perces. They put them on Malaria Flats. It was the most unhealthy place in the history of the Missouri River. And the teepees that they had left were just nothing. They were just rags, practically. And it was pathetic. And the children started dying, and the wounded started dying. Pretty soon the bodies are stacking up. And even the officer, and I forgot his name, but anyway, this is in the text. And there's one book here that Jerome Green wrote about the Nez Perces after Bear Paws, and that Jerome Green book is really good. I've got it over here on the table if you want to look at it. But in there, he says that this officer was so sympathetic with the Nez Perces, he passed a petition around. There are barracks over here that are empty. There are wood stoves in those barracks. It's on higher ground. There's not malaria there, it's not moist there, and there's dry firewood. Let's put the Nez Perces in these empty barracks. And this petition was signed by him, and he got a bunch of other military guys to sign it because they saw the suffering. And General Sherman, when he got this petition, he denied the petition, and he reprimanded the officer who promoted the petition. And, you know, busted him back, and, you know, and you're not on the promotion list anymore. You're done with that, so forget it. And so they continued to suffer until finally they decided they better get him out of there. They were supposed to send him back to the Pacific Northwest. That was the promise Miles made at the time of the surrender. Joseph went to Congress, and a bunch of congressmen met in Lincoln Hall in Washington, D.C. He didn't actually go into the legislature building, but into a separate hall where there were many congressmen, senators, representatives, local clergy, and so on. And he made a little speech there with Ad Chapman, who was a white guy who fired the first shot of the war, now hired on as a government interpreter. And he said, if I would have known how the government was going to lie to me about the conditions of the surrender, I never would have surrendered. He says that in a really bold statement. I would never have surrendered had I realized stealing our horses, taking all of our equipment, not sending us home as they had promised. And of course, Miles and Howard both said, you know, well, it wasn't up to us. You know, we made that promise, yeah, but, you know, higher ups, you know, you get overruled. And Joseph was, you know, adamant about, you know, something's wrong with American society when, you know, people are authorized to make promises, but they don't have any authority to keep them. And I thought that's pretty blunt. That's pretty astute. And I think we would all agree with Joseph that there's something flawed when somebody's authorized to make a promise, but no authority to keep that promise. And so they put him, take him out of Fort Leavenworth, though, and they move him down to the extreme northeast corner of what is now Oklahoma. At that time, it was Indian Territory. They called this the Quapaw Agency. The Quapaw Indians were there, and there were some Modoc Indians and some others. The Modocs gave a warm welcome because they were Oregon Indians. Just the year before, Captain Jack had been hanged after he led a Modoc revolt down there on the California-Oregon border. The Modocs and the Nez Perces knew each other. When the Nez Perces traveled to California to trade at Sutter's Fort in California, they went right through Modoc territory. So they were very aware of who each other was, and they'd had some good relationships. And so about the best treatment that the Nez Perces got was from the Modocs down here in Indian Territory over a year after their surrender. Although in Bismarck, Joseph had been treated to a special dinner, and he's brought into a fancy place and given a fancy hotel dinner in Bismarck. And they're still really proud of that Bismarck, and they'll point the building out to you where Joseph had dinner with somebody who was important. Somebody important. A white guy who was important. He had a uniform and everything. Okay. So, we got people in Canada. We got people down there in the Indian Territory. They weren't in the Modoc country very long at the Quapaw Agency. They moved them out to the north central Indian Territory, what is now just west of Ponca City. And I've gone down there and saw where they are, where they were on the Salt Fork of the Shikaskia River. I think that's how it's pronounced. Anyway, they're there, but they hated it there. There are no mountains there. You've been to Oklahoma. Nothing against Oklahoma. If you're raised there, I'm sure you love it. If you're from Wallowa County, Oregon, or from Idaho, not so much. Not so much. Okay. I went down there, and they said, and my wife and I met this guy. He was part something else. He was tribal, and he told us, he recognized us and said, oh, you guys aren't from here, and you're probably looking for us. I said, yeah, we are. And he showed us. And he said, this is where the cemetery used to be. There used to be a lot of stones out here with Nez Perce written on the stones, different things written in Nez Perce language. And my wife was very interested in that because her great-grandfather fought in the war, and he had 2 children born down there in Oklahoma, and they both died there in Oklahoma, and they were buried there in Oklahoma. And we thought maybe we'll find a stone with her relatives, on this stone. He said, oh no, a farmer came in here with a bulldozer, and he bulldozed all those stones over into this little draw in this brush over here. They're over here though, they're over there, it's pouring down rain. And my wife said, okay, you guys go look for the stones, I'll wait here in the car. So I went over there, and I had my slacks on and my loafers, and I'm going through the mud, and the grass was about this deep. And this Indian guy tells me, oh yeah, be careful where you put your feet. We have a lot of water moccasins around here. They're black, and they're about this big around and this long. And maybe I'll go back to the car right now. I'm going to get my feet wet too here. And, anyway, he swore when he was a little kid, he remembered all those stones with Nez Perce written on them. Now they just have one stone monument there saying this was the celebrated cemetery for the people. When you add up the people that died in Fort Leavenworth and the people that died at Quapaw Agency and the people that died at on the Ponca Reserve here, Tonkawa Reservation, not today because the Tonka was moved in there right after the Nez Perce moved out. More people died in the post-war period than died of bullets during the war. So, you have the humiliation of losing your home and all of this and everything, but in addition to that, more people dying in this period than the earlier period. And then you lost your wealth too. You lost your cattle, you lost your horses. And so, it's just bad news all the way around. A woman, Diane Pearson, wrote a book on the exile though, and she said there were some bright lights there. And one of the things was that the Indian Bureau was really corrupt. And these white guys that were running these big wagon trains that were supposed to supply the Indians were crooked as hell. And these wagon trains were always late, and the goods were always broken open, and there was always stuff pilfered and gone and everything. And Joseph complained about this, and complained so much, they fired everybody and said, if you can do any better, go ahead and do it yourself. So Joseph and a handful of other people, my wife's great-grandfather included, a guy named Bruce Muxmux, who was wanted for murder in Idaho County, but he changed his name and accepted Jesus, so became a new person. And see how Jesus saves? Anyway, so he and Joseph and a couple other guys became the Teamsters. And Diane Pearson writes, these wagon trains were never late. They never hurt any horses, and all the goods were there that were supposed to go there. And once the Indians took over the business of moving the goods, it was completely night and day. Totally corrupt, totally late, and nothing's late, everything's delivered. And Joseph himself handled one of these wagons that was in this, so it was important to the people. That's Diane Pearson, and I forgot the exact name of her book. No, I didn't forget it, because I wrote it down because I was afraid I'd forget it. The name of her book is Nez Perce Indians in the Indian Territory. by Diane Pearson. A really good book. Okay, so that's a little bit about the surrender, the conditions of the surrender, how that was violated, and I think Alan has a bunch of stories that go with this, and we have agreed that he got to tell some of the best stories, so Alan's up to bat. Here you go, Alan.
I forgot my notes, but I'll do the best I can. There's a lot of personal stories in this year of 1877. Many of our tribal people remember those that passed on to their families. But there's one character. His name is Halaktuke, and that means daytime smoker. And this Halaktuke name was given to William Clark in 1806. Well, under the circumstances when they were camped there along the Clearwater River near Kamiah, there were visitations across the river. But Luther Clark never talked about this. They agreed after the Fort Mandan incident with a member of the expedition and another leader's wife, they decided they wouldn't write about those kinds of things anymore. Because aristocrats don't do those kinds of things. Well, supposedly among Indian lore, Lewis left a descendant there. Possibly York as well. William Clark as well. Well, William Clark left a descendant in Kamiah. His name was Halaktuke. That's what we call William Clark, Halaktuke, daytime smoker. His son was given the same name. Well, there's not too much written about Halaktuke Jr., except that there's a photo of him near the Yellowstone River in about 1870, somewhere in that early time period of 1877 or 1870s. And he always called himself Clark. He didn't speak very good English because he always said, "Me Clark, me Clark." So he knew who he was. And he, as far as the research that I and Steve did, we think he is a descendant of Red Bear, either through Red Bear's daughter or some other close relative. And I'm also a descendant of Red Bear. I met a descendant of William Clark somewhere back east at one of the Lewis and Clark conferences. And we got to talk, and he told me who he was, and I told him who I was. So I called him in-law. And he didn't know what to say, but then I told him the circumstances, and he said, "Well, yeah, it could have happened, and maybe you are in-laws, and etc." So those kinds of things happen. What happens when our soldiers now go overseas? Suddenly there's Korean descendants of our soldiers. I don't know, the story goes on and on. So it happens worldwide. But Halaktuke Jr., he's also described in the treaty negotiations of Wallowas of 1855. The red-headed Indian, because he had red hair just like William Clark. So he was called Red Hair at that time, because he had red hair. Well, he shows up now and then in various situations in the history, but he's never made any of note. But the purpose of this union that occurred in 1806, or maybe even 1805, there was a purpose behind it. And some of our Nez Perce young women accepted that duty. And of course, then the son was born. And a reason for that, it's setting up a relationship between two different kinds of people. For relationship building between different people, and of course we carried that on. And some of the young women took upon themselves that responsibility. Well, York also left a descendant among us, as well as Clark. And maybe some other relationship, because in the Julius and Clark journals, they said the men went across the river to trade. And they would take buttons and other small items over there, maybe cloth, and they would come back smiling. So that occurred. Well, the purpose of Halachtuget Jr. was to set up this relationship between two different kinds of people. And that was the purpose. But then when the War of 1877 breaks out, Halachtuget Jr. was in that conflict. And as far as I know, he was involved all the way through all the battles. He survives all these battles. Of course, at that time, he's about 71 years old, which is an elder status in our tribal organization at the time. So he had elder status. But he made it through all these battles, and he ends up in Oklahoma. But there he dies, along with several hundred of our tribal people as well, at Fort Leavenworth and at Tonkawa as well. And like Steve said, we lost hundreds, not to war, but through wounds and disease at that time. And Halachtuget was one of those fatalities. The other note that I found about Halachtuget was that when they killed the last buffalo near Idaho, which was probably somewhere along the upper Salmon River, they mentioned him in a journal of some trader or trapper. So he existed through all this time, but he never became prominent. But that was the purpose. He was to achieve this diplomatic relationship between the U.S. government and also Soyapo, traders and trappers, and also among the tribal people. Well, it never worked out. But yet he went through all this conflict and survived and died, most likely of natural causes, I would think, maybe disease. So those kinds of things happened. And then when they were in exile, of course, in Oklahoma, Joseph thought that, well, if I travel to the center of government, maybe I can plead the cause of my people and they're dying in Oklahoma, that we can return back to our home country. So he travels to Washington, D.C. in 1879. And there he meets with probably some Congress people. I don't know whether he addressed Congress himself or not, but I'm sure he probably talked to some various committees and other congressmen on a one-to-one basis. But there he pled his cause for his people. You know, they're sick and dying, and you know, we want to go home, and we will survive better in our home country. Well, his speech is recorded. It's probably pretty close to what he was actually saying. You know, he wanted to be equal under the law of the United States. He would do that for the survival of his people. You know, he would submit himself to the courts of the United States government. Of course, the Treaty of 1855 was a government-to-government relationship because we're viewed as a nation in that treaty. But then, because the U.S. Constitution is worded in a certain way, that we become underneath the United States Congress, not as citizens, but as national people. And this is our argument nowadays, that there is a government-to-government relationship established since 1855. So the legal status from then on becomes very complicated in Indian law. And it's still very complicated today. And we make those arguments as best we can for natural resources and environmental conditions. And sometimes it carries a lot of weight. But getting back to the exile, after Joseph pleaded his cause, it wasn't until 1885 that they were allowed to come back. The territory that Joseph Van occupied in Oklahoma was given to the Tonkawa tribal people who were exiled out of Texas. And it was about, I believe it was about 1,300 acres. And that's where the graveyard that Steve was describing. And so we realized that the Tonkawas didn't have a territory, so we said, well, give where we occupied, the Nez Perce, and Joseph told this Indian agent, give it to the Tonkawa people. And the Tonkawa people said, we will take care of your graves, of your people, if we are given permission to occupy this territory. And so the Tonkawa people accepted that. And we accepted that agreement as well with the Tonkawa people. And when we went down to Oklahoma for memorials back in the 1990s, and we also had other delegations who go down there previously from our governing body. But we had a number of our tribal people go down there. Horace Axel was our religious leader at the time, and we had ceremonies down there to memorialize those that remained there. We couldn't identify the actual grave sites, but we, in general, the Tonkawa people pointed out, right here, in this general area, they pointed out, this is where the graves are, because it was just flat and it was used as a crop field. But we went down and we reestablished it as a graveyard. And we had it fenced off. But we don't have any grave markers. We just know in general this is a burial area. And of course, Horace Axtell and he carried on some ceremonies for us. And we blessed the ground and the graves and so forth. But the Tonkawa people were always mindful of what they were doing. You know, they tried to protect the graveyard, but then they couldn't because it didn't have the power to stop this farmer from doing that what he did to the graveyard. But they did put up a memorial down there, and they did fence it off. But the relationship between all tribes in exile in Oklahoma, there was Kiowas and Modocs and many others. A lot of Missouri tribes were exiled into Oklahoma. But then we traded songs, probably with the Modoc and also the Kiowa. The Kiowas were exiled down there. Some of them were exiled. I met a Kiowa down there, and he said, oh, we gave the Nez Perce a song, and here it is, you know, and he sang the song. And of course, it was one of our songs that we sang all the time at powwow. Now, who gave a song to which one? So, and of course I heard this same song since childhood. So I always assumed, well, that's a Nez Perce song. Well, it's possible. It could be a Kiowa song as well. But intertribal relationships in Oklahoma went pretty well because everyone knew the conditions and why they were sent there. So we tried to make the best of it. But Joseph making his plea, it took a number of years since trip to D.C. And they would be visited by Reverend Reuben, and I think corporate lawyer went down there as well to try to get them back to the reservation area as well. Reuben was an interpreter, and the lawyer was one of the reservation tribal leaders at the time. But they didn't quite have the effect of Joseph going to Congress. But eventually the powers that be eventually said, well, we can return the Joseph band to the Northwest. They didn't say specifically where. So they put them on a train, traveled by train, and I think even by boat. But finally got back to Wallowas on the Columbia River. There they were asked a question. Who do you want to be? Do you want to be a good Indian, or do you want to be your own self? What did that mean? What that question meant was, if you want to be a good Indian, you can go back to the reservation in Idaho. If you want to be yourself, you're going to be going to Colville, Washington with Joseph. Joseph was never allowed to go back to Idaho, except for one or two trips for possible sites that he was pleading for getting back to Idaho. But he never was granted the permission to do that. So that was a question. Who do you want to be, a good Indian, or do you want to be yourself? What that meant was, if you want to be a good Indian, that meant, do you want to be a Christian Nez Perce? If you want to be yourself, you can live the way you lived before the white man came. You practice your own religion. And so that question being asked, certain people raised their hand and said, yes, I will go back to Idaho and be a good Indian. Others said, no, I'm going with Joseph. Joseph was never allowed to go back because Mount Idaho had indictments, and he had been indicted with about 16 other Nez Perces for murder at white people and up the river from there. So if you went back to Idaho, you would have to go on trial for those murders and about 16 or 17 other Nez Perces. So that was one reason why he wasn't allowed to go back to Idaho. But my grandfather lied. He was able to come back in about 1880 or 81. But he said he would be a good Indian. He only spent about 2 years in Oklahoma. But then a few Nez Perce negotiated their way back. But they had to agree to be a good Indian. Well, my grandfather, he lied. He said, yeah, I'll be a good Indian. But what he would do when he got back home, he practiced his own religion, Wallowas. That's what we call it, Wallowas. And the way they would do it, when they got home, they would go from a different home every different week, and then go through all the way to the different families that practice the old ways. So our religion went underground. And of course, Christian Nez Perce could go to church, and practice that religion. But others, we had to go underground, and my grandfather was one of those. And also my father had to lie. He said, yeah, I'll go join a Catholic church. The reason he went to join a Catholic was that he didn't like the Lapway boarding school, but he was actually stolen and kidnapped in his mother's yard and taken to the boarding school in Lapway. He didn't have any choice, because the government had made a census of all the Nez Perces prior to that for the Allotment Act of 1893, and it was being applied to the Nez Perce Reservation by Alice Fletcher. Well, prior to that, they took a census. But the reason they took a census was because when a Nez Perce died, after the allotments were given out, they didn't know how to pass it on to their descendants. Anyone could argue and say, I should have that land. And some non-relatives actually claimed some of our own property that should have been with the family. And that occurred. And of course, the other thing that was land loss was that after the allotment, the agent could waive the 25-year restriction of the sale of Nez Perce allotments. And they would do that for a non-Indian that wanted that Indian's property. It was done. Because a Nez Perce couldn't read a purchase agreement, and it was taken away from them. So those are the kinds of things that were occurring though, even after the Allotment Act. But the Christian Nez Perce agreed to the Allotment Act because they thought, well, this is where the allotments are given out to individual Indians. All members of a Nez Perce family receive some kind of allotment of land, even if a young child, they got a piece of property. Well, this 25-year restriction was waived by the superintendent, and my grandfather lost about 4 or 5 plots that way because some of his children died, and I don't know whether he sold it or it was disposed of in some other way by the superintendent. But much of our land was lost that way as well. So those things that happened after 1885, we were still suffering under the coming of the white man. And this period is called Uyat Soyapa. And that simply means the coming of the white man and what's happening to us. And it starts from the day that Lewis and Clark show up. And it goes all the way through to the Allotment Act, and even further, even up to the Marion Report of about 1920, and the Declaration of Native Americans becoming citizens in 1924. So that describes this whole process. And my father would talk about that. And with these 3 old men, would say the prophecies are coming true. When the white man comes among us, he's going to draw a line across the earth, and he's going to say, this is yours, and this is mine. Division of property and land, township lines, state lines, county lines. That's what that is. And also, another prophecy is that we don't know when your name will go into a book. Many families, when they became Christians would write their family history in Bibles and their names. So that's one instant. And another instance is the allotment act. Your name goes into the book that supposedly gives you a piece of the earth. So this is what these three old men would talk about. And other things that they would also talk, when a white man comes among us, he's going to go faster and faster and faster. What that meant was the railroad wheels turning faster and faster, then an automobile coming and going faster and faster. And then they will make things that will go through the air, airplanes. And it'll still go faster and faster. Rocket ships that circle the earth. So why did they know these things? Or even hint that they knew something was going to occur? There's a practical answer. 100 years before Lewis and Clark show up, there were mixed blood French Indian people that came northwest and to the California coast as well. So 100 years before Lewis and Clark show up, these half-blood French Indian people would come to us and tell us these stories of what was occurring to them on the East Coast. They draw the lines across the earth. The rivers are going to run red with our blood. They're going to abuse our elders and take away our children. Those are the things that's going to happen to you. One day there will be a white-faced animal about the size of a deer, and behind that animal will be a white-faced or pale-looking creature. And that will come through Lapwai Valley. That happened. Way before we even seen Lewis and Clark, we had this prophecy that would occur. And it did happen. How did we know these things? The simple and the most practical idea is that these mixed-blood French Indians came west. Well, West Coast Indians went to the East Coast as well, even before the horse. We acquired the horse about 1700, which was about 100 years prior to Lewis and Clark. So if you've seen a strange animal come into your country, what are the questions that we need to ask? What does this animal do? What does it eat? Is it usable like the dog? Can you train it? What is the name of it? Where did it come from? The horse was a new animal to us. It was similar to the dog because the dog had 4 legs, and the dog we used as pack animals and also to help us hunt. Can the horse do this as well? No, it can't do all those other things that the dog does. But you can ride it if you train it. We called the dog Chacomco. We called the horse Sika. The first part of Chacomco is almost similar to Sika. So it's similar. It's just that it's had a shorter name, the horse does. So we knew that the horse was going to be useful to us, and the story goes that we probably got the horse from the Plains people, principally the black people. It could have been other people, but it could have been a show band as well. And there was a little story that my aunt told me one time. She says, well, the first horse we seen was a white horse. It was on the Snake River near Clarkston. That was probably the first white horse that we've seen. You know, there's other colors of horses that we've seen, but she said that was one of the first white horses. But if you look back into the breeding lines, white gives you more varied color than any other color. And since we knew how to gild stallions from the Spanish, because we went down to where the Spanish were in the Southwest, and we quickly learned through that process how to gild stallions from the Spanish. So that means that we traveled in all these directions and we seen things, but we also learned things. And there's stories about our people traveling to the redstone quarries and near the Great Lakes, way before Lewis and Clark showed, or shortly after. I can't tie that story down, but there's various stories of individual Indians going north, east, and south, and even to the west. There's Nez Perce was called Tahoma, and he was a runner. And this is before we had the horse. And he would run from here to Nisqually people near who lived at the base of Mount Rainier. The Nisqually people called Mount Rainier Tahoma. So our Nez Perce runner was given that name, Tahoma. And that was his job, was to run from here to Tahoma. So Indian people traveled from the East Coast to the West Coast to the East Coast, and north and south. So we knew many things that was going to occur. We knew that the rivers would run red with our blood because it happened to the eastern tribes. The same would happen to us. And all these other prophecies, some of them I have mentioned, but those have come true. And it also said that it would take 5 generations for the Nez Perce and other tribal people to recover from the coming of the white man. In my estimation, we're in the 6th generation now. We've gone through the 5 generations, which is roughly 150 years. So we're here in the 6th. And you can see that change if you go and look back at it. Where did it occur? When the Nez Perce tribe and their leaders became influential in their community, that's when the recovery started.
Alan, I'm sorry, but we're gonna probably have to stop it. That's a heck of a good place to start. When the Nez Perce become influential in their community.
Okay.
Yeah, we went over a little bit, but if you want to wrap up another sentence or two, or Steve has one more, but some of these people have to probably get back to work, so you go ahead and wrap that up, and Steve, if you want to say something else.
Well, I guess all that is that there's more than an 1877 war.
Right.
There's a hell of a lot more. And also, come visit our casino.